it wouldn't be the most original start to a video about 2020, saying that 2020 was a bad year for many and worst for others. And I could easily recap the shit-tastic events that happened over the course of 2020, but one, that's not the purpose of this video. Two, it would make this video much longer than it already is probably going to be. What I wanted to do with this video is sort of give a condensed music consumer report style video, the Year in Music 2020 edition, if you will. I wanted to sort of do a monthly segment over the course of 2020, but 2020, so yeah. Now, I haven't been able to listen to every individual album that got released over the course of 2020, but I'd say I listened to about 5 to 6 albums a week on average. So that sort of adds up to this number. But I'm also not going to go over every individual record that I listened to, because then this video would be over 6 hours long, and nobody would want to watch that. I wouldn't want to have to spend the time editing it. I'm going to go over each individual month. I'm going to give the top 3 for the month and the worst 3 of the month, followed by maybe a few other noteworthy releases that I think you should check out for one reason or another. And at the end of each little month segment, I'm going to give an average album score with additional points for each EP and single that I add onto the playlist, which I do have playlists for each individual month that I've taken over the course of 2020, so all those are linked in the description down below, as well as my top 50 albums of 2020, if you want to start that one as well. It goes from 50 to 1. So, pretty straightforward concept, and at the end of this video, I'm going to average the total score of each month to sort of give 2020 an official grade, musically speaking. With that being said, I'm Greg of Gregarious Media. Welcome to the YIM 2020. Let's go. January tends to be the month where not a lot of things happen in terms of major album releases. Usually that's saved for the second half, when the marketing of major labels tends to pick up a bit. That doesn't mean there aren't some solid independent releases in the meantime, but usually the lull starts at the second half of December to the end of the first half of January, where usually the marketing for anything in between then, the week before Christmas and a couple of weeks after Christmas, usually tends to be a pretty slow point in terms of releases. But 2020 actually had a fair amount of releases this year, especially when it came to the start of the year, which I was pleasantly surprised by. For the top 3, starting off with Poppy, I Disagree. This is a heavy industrial metal, pop, and grunge record, all sort of clusterfucked into one, and the transitions from genre to genre are near flawless, with sharp riffs, melodic hooks, and the switch-ups that are just near... What did you say?
You said near and I said perfection.
Sharp riffs, massive hooks, and just melodic switch-ups galore throughout this record, and which I would highly recommend, especially if you're into the sort of weirder blend of genres that you just wouldn't expect to work out as well as they do. For the silver, we got Mac Miller's posthumous record, Circles. I'll admit, I've never been the biggest a Mac Miller fan, but since his sophomore record, the Watching Movies with the Sound Off, I've always respected him as an artist, and especially when he got into his more experimental side. And this record showed his more singer-songwriter approach to records. And granted, a lot of the production was handled after Mac's passing, but the way that it was blended was beautiful. And I really wasn't expecting this record to hit as hard as it did, but truly, rest in peace, Mac Miller. And it's amazing that he pretty much had this much still left in his arsenal. This is a truly great record. And for the gold of January, my number 1 record of the month is Apocalyptica's Cello. And it takes a lot for an instrumental album to really catch my attention. And Apocalyptica are one of those bands that tend to catch my attention the most. Obviously with their unique brand of cello-based metal. So you look at this title and you go, Cell Zero, Cell O, Cello, huh. But this goes back to their more instrumental roots of things. And every composition is brilliant, dynamic, and just what you would expect out of Apocalyptica. And done near perfection. So, of course, with the top 3 best, I also have to go with the top 3 worst, just to balance things out a little bit. At the bottom bronze, we have Breaking Benjamin with Aurora. Who was this made for? This is basically a collection of acoustified Breaking Benjamin tracks, plus, I believe, one new one, if I remember correctly, but I don't remember the title of it, so obviously it wasn't that memorable. But you have features of other artists on these songs that are basically the acoustic versions of songs. And mind you, I put that in quotations because it sounds like the drums are ripped straight off the original studio tracks from those original song sessions. And the acoustics just sound very overblown. Ben's vocals, honestly, some of them sound like he re-recorded them. Others, he sounded like they were just ripped straight from the original audio recordings of the other albums. It just is a mess for something that is supposed to be a more acoustic album. It just sounds so drowned in studio mixing that it just doesn't sound like a true blue, like, acoustified record. It's just, I don't know, who is this for? For the silver, for the silver of the worst of the month, we have Yellow Claw Never Dies. And I haven't listened to this group since Amsterdam Trap Music, which was a pretty solid EP. And I saw this on the release schedule and thought, well, let's give it a shot. And man, it's no wonder I haven't gone to EDM very much with genres like this. Just seems like every other EDM album I've attempted to listen to over the past 5 years, and it just does not leave an impact at all. With the exception of a couple of tracks, especially the Fat Man Scoob feature, because, of course, his voice is very iconic. But other than that, yeah, at least this was short. Unlike what is number 1 on the worst of January, which is Lil Wayne's Funeral. This is the definition of an overblown record. This has 24 tracks, and the vast majority of them are filler. Basically, if you cut this record in half, you would probably have a decent Lil Wayne record. Not sure if the highs even rank up to that of Carter 5. In fact, Carter 5, I think, had a lot of high points and gave a lot of people hope that Lil Wayne's career trajectory would only continue to go up. But it has the problems of the inconsistencies that Carter 5 had, without the excuse of certain songs being recorded in certain sessions over the span of like 5 or 6 years. Other noteworthy releases that you should check out are Martha High and the Italian Royal Family's Nothing's Going Wrong. This is a very solid soul record with pretty raw recording value. Sometimes Martha's vocals are a little bit over the instrumental a little bit. It isn't blended or EQ'd the best, but the performances instrumentally and from Martha are just beautiful. It's a fantastic soul record. AJJ's Good Luck Everybody. This is easily their best record since Knife Man, and this was released independently. I was very glad that they finally got this released, and lyrically this just hit harder and harder and harder as the year progressed. While I would have loved more energetic moments more consistently throughout the record, like Normalization Blues and Loudmouth, this is still a very solid record throughout, and it doesn't have as much of the production problems as their previous couple of records have. So, cheers to AJJ releasing their record independently, and I wait to hear their follow-up. Eminem's Music to be Murdered By. If this is music that I'm going to be murdered by, it's a pretty sad and pathetic way to die. Not that there weren't certain high points on this record, but the problem with it is that while the highs reach some of the highs of Kamikaze, it is also the length of Revival, and the low points are damn near close. Could have been trimmed a lot in order to be a more consistent record. If it was about the size of Kamikaze, I think this would have been just another solid release from Eminem, nothing groundbreaking or anything, but the high points are still there and prove that Eminem does have at least some relevance in 2020. And yes, we're going to get to side B. Give it time. And last but not least, Kesha's High Road. While this was not a favorite of mine from this year, I thought the high points from this record were also very solid. Kesha decides to sort of just throw caution to the wind and just experiment with pretty much every style that she wants, with mixed results. But the high points on here are still extremely solid, so I would highly recommend giving this one a listen. You'll probably find a lot more to enjoy than dislikes. So out of the 20 albums I listened to in January, the average album score totals 6.07, with 3 EPs also added onto the list, as well as 13 singles. The grand total of January's average is 6.5. February starts picking up the release numbers, and some of my favorite releases came out this month. For the bronze, we have King Cruel with Man Alive. This is a psychedelic juggernaut that really took me on a trip, and while the project is definitely something to listen to as a whole, I wouldn't recommend shuffling this record at all. It's very much a front-to-back listen. It's definitely an experience. It's easily one of the best psychedelic records I've heard in a very long time. Spanish love songs, Brave Faces Everyone. Pretty much think AJJ's Good Luck Everybody in terms of the lyricism hitting very hard for the 2020 context, and just smashing you over the face of it till you're just nothing but a broken human being. With the exception that at the end of every song usually tends to try to uplift you in some way, shape, or form, but god damn, this album is just depressing. It's a beautifully depressing record, and easily made my top 10 the second I heard it, but god, man. And for the gold, we have Sepultura's Quadra. And for a metal band that has been around for over 3 decades, I believe now going on to their 4th decade, this is a record that I was not expecting to be nearly as great as it was. This showcases them doing all the styles that they've explored previously in like almost EP style releases. Like the first 3 is more thrash, the second 3 is more groove, the third 3 is more progressive, and the fourth, the final leg, those 3 tracks are much more on the slower end of things, but every single moment is just fantastic, and Sepultura doing what they do best. And this record, I think, just proves that Sepultura still have plenty of just ammunition to just fire off in the metal world. Now, for all the highs that February brought, unfortunately, it did bring a lot of lows to almost even it out. Starting off with Real Estate's The Main Thing, which is pretty much NyQuil the album. I really don't have much to say about this. I've tried listening to this at least a couple of times before recording this video, and god, there is not much noteworthy about this thing. It is just very sleepy. If you need music to help you in the background to fall asleep, I would recommend this record. If you're looking for something actually interesting, no. And for the silver in Shitsville, we have Green Day's Father of All Motherfuckers. Basically the record that I'm pretty sure has to be just trying to get out of their contract because there's no way that they're actually proud of this record. They just can't be. I mean, the start of the album cover, come on. But the fact that they basically were trying to make a Foxborough Hot Tubs record, but extremely poor, under the Green Day name. This basically just seems like Green Day just shat this out for the sake of shitting it out. And hello, dog. How are you doing? Look at this cute dog. Oh, she is so cute. She is so cute. Yes, she is. What? You want to be in the video?
No. No.
And the golden shit stain of February goes to Claude Von Stroke's Freaks and Beaks. Now, this is an electronic artist that I just happened to listen to this record just because it was one of the new releases on Spotify, and I kind of liked the title of it, Claude Von Stroke's Freaks and Beaks. Album art looked interesting. I thought, let's give it a listen. It was an EDM record, and the first track actually got me pretty intrigued, the title track. The rest of this record just took a very solid nosedive downward. So maybe I just jumped on this guy's discography at the wrong time, because it looks like he has plenty of other records before this one, but god, there's just not a lot of progression with a lot of these. They do sort of have a musical progression. It's not very interesting. Some of the weird vocal samples and overlays on here are distorted in such a bad way, like to a point where I feel nauseous listening to it. I'm not even sure how that's possible, but a couple of them really made that happen. So if there's a better jumping on point for this guy's music, please someone recommend it to me, because this album certainly was not it. Other noteworthy releases of February was Denzel Curry's and Kenny Beats Unlocked. This thing is under 20 minutes long, but it's just straightforward. Denzel just spitting whatever the hell he wants to spit over Kenny Beats. Solid production. This is another solid record in Denzel's canon. Give it a shot if you haven't already. Caribou Suddenly. Now, this is the EDM I kind of like, and I'm not even sure if EDM is the proper genre term I should use for this thing, but the progressions, the melodies, the rhythms that are on here are just extremely solid, catchy, and pleasant to the ear. The Birds of Prey soundtrack. This was actually extremely solid front to back, not gonna lie. It was very solid, almost pretty consistent for a soundtrack. I wouldn't say this is up there with the Black Panther soundtrack, but it's pretty close, honestly. And Ozzy Osbourne's Ordinary Man. Now, this guy has plenty of records in his discography that I know of from front to back, and for a late career record, it's not his best, but it's pretty damn solid. The title track, especially with Elton John, I really love that as a single. So, out of 25 albums, February has an average album score of 6.54, and on the playlist we also have 2 EPs and 16 singles, so the grand total for February is 6.9, which is 0.4 more points than January, so already a pretty solid progression upward. So for March, the highlights were very high, the lows weren't super low, and while on the playlist I didn't have as many EPs or singles as the previous months, overall, the score, I think, is going to be pretty good. Kicking off our top 3, we have Viscera with Obsidian. This is a deathcore supergroup that is just super technical, very melodic flourishes, and just brutal. Pretty much all I have to say about it. And it's a release that I've gone back to time and time again since it's dropped. So, really, if you're looking for an extremely heavy record that still is very nice to the ear, give this one a shot. And for the silver, we have Code Orange's Underneath. They had some industrial teasings with their previous album Forever, but this one just goes full on into the industrial metal genre, and they execute it perfectly. For 14 tracks, these guys know exactly what they're doing. It is just crushing to your skull metal and hardcore, and I love it. And the number 1 goes to a record that I was not even anticipating being released this year, was The Scratches Couldn't Give a Rat's. These Irish dudes, who I only just discovered last year thanks to Spotify's playlist and their Whole Buzz EP, decided to release their record 3 months early because of the whole COVID epidemic. So, while this was supposed to be released in June, they just said, fuck it, we're releasing it now, enjoy. Yeah, it made my top 10. Easily. God, I don't even know how to explain this properly. There's just a bunch of lyrical wit, fantastic percussion, fantastic acoustic rhythms. It's just super hard acoustic music. If you are familiar with the Native Howl, it's not quite thrash, but these guys just have this super unique sound that I'm probably just butchering describing, but that should only mean that you just check this out and listen to it for yourself. These guys, I hope, come to America at some point once COVID is all done and everything. I don't honestly know how big the Scratch are in Ireland, but these guys truly have the potential to be one of the biggest groups ever. Now on to the bottom 3. Like I said, these aren't terrible records, but I do have this segment for a reason. And I have to start with Brian Fallon's Local Honey. Brian's doing more folky, soft rock kind of stuff that just makes me really wish that Gaslight Anthem would just make another record already, because, no offense to Brian, it's not a bad record, it's just bland. Phantogram with Ceremony. This is indie electronic pop rock that just sounds like every other indie electronic pop rock that I've heard over the course of the past 5 years. Nothing really stand out about this record. It's not bad, it's pleasant enough to the ear, but I forget it immediately afterward. And Porches, Ricky Music. This is pretty much a copy and paste of what I just said. Not quite in the electronic vein, if I remember correctly, but still not a lot that I could say that I liked. but I can't say it was bad. It's just really not my thing. Other noteworthy releases, because this month had such high point releases: Dua Lipa's Future Nostalgia. This is the disco pop revival done right. And this was damn immediately in my year-end list. Like, there is so many great songs on here that if it wasn't for COVID, I think this thing would have just been a smash at every single dance club. Because honestly, this record just kept bringing my mood up and up and up throughout this whole thing. Jhené Aiko's Chilombo. This is basically Sex Music the album. And you can't go wrong with that. And Chilombo Deluxe is one of the very rare occasions where during this whole streaming trend thing of adding almost another album's worth of material onto an already existing project, that actually still works, because even the deluxe of Chilombo is still extremely solid. Another record that also falls in that category is The Weeknd's After Hours. Fuck the Grammys. I never cared about the Grammys anyway, but honestly, if you're not saying that Blinding Lights was not one of the biggest fucking songs of 2020, you're an idiot. This easily has some of his best material to date. Even if it's not his darkest, most brooding record, it definitely falls more into some of his more poppier tendencies. It's easily some of the best material that he's done so far, and if this is a trajectory that he's heading down, I can't wait to see how much more he experiments with it. And one other release that I figured I had to mention was Jay Electronica's A Written Testimony. This was a hip-hop record that basically rivaled Detox in terms of, is this ever going to get released? Because Jay Electronica finally released something after so many years of hype as one of the best lyricists because of singles and like a mixtape that he dropped early in the 2010s or late 2000s. And Jay-Z had the best parts on this record. Jay-Z literally contributes like a third of this record, and all of his parts are the best parts, which sucks to see because Jay Electronica does have that potential still, but a lot of his verses just don't have as much presence as Jay-Z's does, and the production quality, the sound of the production, the sound of the beats aren't really that great anyway, but the production is just so inconsistent throughout the entire album that it's just a chore to sit through. So it finally came out at the very least, so if you're interested in a historic moment in hip-hop that is just bound to disappoint, it exists. So out of the 24 records that I listened to in March, the average album score was 6.79, and I didn't have any EPs on the playlist, but I did have 7 singles on the playlist. So the total score for March is 6.86. Now April basically picked up where March left off, but the low points were starting to come back in a little bit more. However, before we get into those, we have our top 3 of the month, starting with Fiona Apple's Fetch the Bolt Cutters. And this was praised to the high heavens for a lot of music critics, and for good reason. I'm not immune to it. This record is fantastic. It is very bizarre, it's unorthodox, dynamic, very rhythmic, and very odd in its percussion choices, which, as a drummer, I'm a little bit biased. I loved that. And Fiona's lyrics are just gripping as ever on this record. So if you're looking for another fantastic Fiona Apple record, hey, here you go. For the silver, we got Rina Sawayama with Sawayama. And this is probably my favorite pop record of the year. I mean, it blends so many different genres together, but still in a pop context that I don't even know how you can categorize this thing. You have your dance pops, you have your grunge, you have your rocks, you have your ballads, and like early 2000s, like Destiny's Child sounding shit that is phenomenally great. So for anybody who slept on this record, go check it out now. And this record was only topped by Trivium's What the Dead Men Say. And I loved Sin the Sentence. But I think this follow-up is a much more leaner and focused album than Sin the Sentence. And it still has a bunch of thrash, a bunch of groove, a bunch of metalcore, all fused together. And Alex on the drums, easily the best addition to Trivium, hands down. And again, I'm a drummer, I'm biased, but are you listening to how this guy plays behind the kit? Holy shit. So, of course, let's go into the bottom three now with, unfortunately, probably the biggest disappointment for me this entire year. AWOL Nations, Angel Miners and the Lightning Riders. Was this a concept record that I just missed the concept entirely? Because, unfortunately, the sonic trajectory of this record is just so watered down compared to what they had on their previous record, which was arguably my favorite release of theirs so far. It was definitely more rock-oriented, it was much more consistent, and then this follow-up just waters it all down, and the inconsistencies that plagued an album like Run come full circle on here, again. And the production is just super muddy in comparison too. Like, the bass just hardly exists. And when you do hear it, it's just so shit. And speaking of shit, at number 2 for the bottom, we have DaBaby. Blame It on DaBaby. And only the standard version, because I was not about to sit through a deluxe version of it. No thank you. And yes, it did have its high points, like Rockstar, and Jump, and maybe one or two other tracks that I'm not remembering off the top, but DaBaby decided to experiment a little bit on here, and most of those did not pan out well, and when he doesn't experiment, it's pretty much by the numbers that everyone criticizes DaBaby for. His flows are very consistent, but almost to a fault. His lyricism isn't extremely great by any means. It's pretty standard. And, yeah. Just, I do blame it on DaBaby. This album sucks. But not as bad as the number 1 in the bottom 3, which is Purity Ring's Womb. This got boring very, very fast. Like, from the sounds of it, and I'm not familiar with Purity Ring at all, this is a group that was very heavy in the influence and popularity of indie electronic music. You can't really sell that with this one, though. And this is supposedly like a comeback record, if I remember correctly. Editing will correct me otherwise, but yeah, this just bored me to death. This is also another NyQuil album. Even more so than the Real Estates record was. So other noteworthy releases of the month, one of them goes to Testament's Titans of Creation. It's not revolutionary. Testament's sound is pretty signature to a fault. You'll recognize this as another good Testament record. Some of you will like it more, some of you will like it less than the previous one. I think it's another solid addition. Testament just continue being Testament, and I enjoy it. Red's Declaration. They're one of the few alternative metal bands that I listened to since middle school that I still enjoy to this day, and this is probably one of the more straightforward records that they've had since their past couple of records sort of expanded more on the electronic and atmospheric and symphonic elements very hard. This one is much more straightforward in the alternative metal vein, and I think they've written some of their heaviest and best material since 2015, and I'm more than here for whatever follows this up. Quale Chris with Innocent Country 2. I have not listened to the first, so maybe contextually I would get more from this record than if I listened to the first one and then this one, but the production is very slick and bizarre, just as Quale Chris is with his bars and his flow, so you really can't go wrong with this. And I'm going to have a shout out here toward the end here for Mannequin Republic's Separation. If you listen to this record, despite the very obvious low budget production recording that this album has, the songwriting is just, it's easily some of the best progressive, screamo, alternative. It's kind of hard to categorize this album also, but I really loved the songwriting of this. I just wish the production value was just a little bit pushed up. So hopefully whatever the band follows this up with will have a bit more of a cleaner recording, but I hope the songwriting just continues to just get more weird and out there, because this is a band that people should really be looking out for. So with that, April, 26 records, average out to 6.69 on an album rating scale. And I didn't have any EPs on the playlist, but I did have 10 singles, so the total score for April was 6.79. Now, May had also a ton of great highlights. In fact, some of my top 10 records came from this month. Unfortunately, so did the top 10 worst of this month. May was pretty all over the place in terms of quality. The highlights, at number 3, we have Charlie XCX with How I'm Feeling Right Now. This is just a very isolated hyperpop record. This was basically like the first official quarantine record, and Charlie pulls this off in spades. I really enjoyed the previous record, even if I felt it was a bit long and probably could have been trimmed a little bit. This record brings it much more aggressive, much more raw, and it doesn't overstay its welcome. Charlie pulls off another fantastic hyperpop record. What's more is there to say? At number 2 for the silver, we have Freddie Gibbs and The Alchemist with Alfredo. And yeah, again, Gibbs comes through with another excellent dose of coke rap, funny ass coke rap, and The Alchemist brings some very luscious, regal production. Not a lot in terms of like super over the head bangers. In fact, this is pretty experimental for The Alchemist, unless I just have not been listening to his production that closely over the past few years. But yeah, this is another fantastic combo that I hope we get another combination from. And the number 1 album of May, and one of my top 5 records of the year, is Jeff Rosenstock's No Dream. Now, this is a bit more pop-punk leaning than an album like Spanish Love Songs was. The sonic trajectory tends to be a little bit more uplifting, and also has a little bit of metal rhythms and a bit more hardcore, directly hardcore sounds in the mix. But yeah, no, the lyrics are also almost just as crushing. Nothing says a quarter-century crisis like having Spanish Love Songs and Jeff Rosenstock very, very high for your year-end list. But the energy captured on this album is just intense, uncertain, really not knowing where to go with the chaos of the world going on, but just knowing that toward the end, there is some light at the end of the tunnel, and that you just gotta go through with it and have as much fun as you can while not completely breaking down. And honestly, this is probably my favorite album of Jeff's so far, so keep it up, man. But the bottom 3 for May is a fucking doozy. Starting with the 1975's Notes from an Unconditional Forum. Okay, I did read that right. This is such a sonic hodgepodge that, just like Lil Wayne's Funeral, way too many tracks. You could have cut down this record by half, and you would have had probably a decent release. But the lyrics are so goddamn pompous. Some of these tracks just instrumentally are near migraine-inducing. It's just, who would listen to this front to back and say that this is a magnum opus? This is a magnum shit. Not so much, though, as Asking Alexandria's Like a House on Fire. Curiosity got the better of me with this release, as I've never really listened to an Asking Alexandria record before, and I actually went into this completely blind, not knowing the singles at all. I figured they probably would have a little bit of a metalcore sound, like their older stuff, because I did know at least a couple of songs from there, but I never listened to a full album. They just go completely butt rock on this record, and it is some of the most generic shit I have ever heard. Like, this is the record that was marketed as, this is what we wanted to be all along. So another shit alt-rock band that probably would have been okay for, like, the first half of 2010s, but now just sounds aged as milk. This is basically just by the numbers 2000s post-grunge butt rock that has been done better. Like, at least Nickelback had riffs. What the fuck is this? And another album that I had just curiosity get the better of me on is my number 1 worst of May, and that is Nav's Good Intentions. Now, I'm aware the dude had released 2 albums later after this, and I did not attempt a single one, because this was enough for me to just say no. When I listen to it, the bars are so goddamn bad, Nav's flows are so goddamn boring and bland, and the production is just as equally boring. I don't understand how hip-hop Twitter has so many Nav stans. I don't get it. What am I missing here? The production, lyrics, his presentation is just all piss poor, and yet somehow the dude released 3 projects and some people actually like it. I don't mean to be sounding like an obnoxious gatekeeper from the early era of YouTube, but can someone just sell to me what Nav's contribution is? Thankfully, the other noteworthy releases are significantly better. We have American Aquarium's Laminations. This is an amazing alt-country record that is my jumping on point for the band, so I hope to get to their earlier discography at some point this year, because this is just a fantastic record, and from the sounds of it, they've been doing this style pretty much throughout their career, and I really enjoy it. You also have Havoc with V, or 5, I'm guessing the Roman numeral 5, it is their 5th record. And if you're looking for some old school 80s sounding thrash with a little bit of slap bass, very heavy in the mix, this is your shit. It was my shit. I hope it's your shit as well. You also have Perfume Genius with Set My Heart on Fire Immediately. Fantastic pop record. Just array of emotions and atmospheres that just all together as a cohesive listen, it is fantastic. And unfortunately, I have not really listened to a lot of Perfume Genius, but from the sounds of it, I've been missing a lot. So this is a good jumping on point. I hope to also listen to the earlier discography and hopefully be just as blown away. And another shout out to end this segment is Time Out Timmy and the self-titled record. This is the final release from the group. They are sort of a hardcore pop-punk band, and there's plenty of tracks galore on here, and just like classic hardcore, a lot of the songs are short, but this is really just a very solid release overall, and I hope everybody from Time Out Timmy is doing what they want to do and just having a ball post this project, because this is really a good album to end their career on. So the average score based on 31 albums, holy shit. So based on the average of 31 albums, the average album score for May ended up being 6.3. And on the playlist, I also had 1 EP and 11 singles, so the total score for the month is 6.51. It is starting to go back down a little bit, but if I recall correctly, if I go through this script, it bounces right back up in June. June was a really solid turnaround month for me personally, just outside of music here for a second. It's when I got a new day job. I was able to cope with my anxiety a lot more throughout this COVID hellhole, and also I got engaged this month. So June was a very, very solid month for me on a personal level. Now, musically speaking, it was a little bit more neutral than May was. The highs weren't nearly as high as May, but they weren't really as low either. And the top 3 pretty much were the only albums I think I rated an 8 or higher. I think these were the only ones. For the bronze, we have IDK with IDK and Friends 2, the Basketball County soundtrack? Is that what I wrote? Oh, that is the title. This is a great hip-hop album that is just over 20 minutes. Pretty much, if you like Denzel Curry's Unlocked, you're going to like this one too. Short and simple to the point. Very solid rapping and production throughout. The silver, we have Sports Team with Deep Down Happy. It's an indie rock, post-punk record that I couldn't help but enjoy with a dumb smile on my face the entire playthrough. So, if you also want that dumb smile on your face, listen to it. And of course, if we're talking June, you cannot have, at your number 1 spot, not be Run the Jewels RTJ4. Possibly the best timed release of any of their records, and which is saying something because they've always had just the most timely releases of all their records so far. But this one is just the best timed record out of anything that's been released this entire year so far. The album just topically curb stomped 2020. LP and Killer Mike are coming through with just their classic flows and lyricism, but with much more of a serious and even political tinge that was slightly explored on RTJ3. That usually the comparison is that the viciousness and aggressiveness of RTJ2 with the experimentation of RTJ3 pretty much makes up this record. And I can see why. I'm not sure if this is my personal favorite of theirs, but I gotta be honest, it's pretty damn close if I really have to compare all of them. And the bottom three, like I said, not nearly as low as May, but pretty much a lot of them end up kind of just being snoozers. Speaking of which, the bronze at the bottom here is Sleepy Hollow, with Sleepy for President. It's a decent little release. It's not that bad. The production's pretty simplistic. Sleepy doesn't have really any bad bars from anything I remember. And, I see potential with this guy. I just don't think this album really stands out enough. There's one track on there that I did put on the main playlist where the bass is just explosive. Like, I could hear the bass through my phone, and as anyone knows, trying to listen to good bass on phones is usually impossible. Somehow that one track made my phone shake. I don't even know how, but it did. Then you have Tiana Taylor with The Album, and for all of the high points on this record, because there are so many highlights, there are just far too many low points, as well as the fact that, just like other records that were released this year, it just drags so fucking much. If you trimmed this down in half, you would have had a fantastic debut album from Tiana. Or would this technically be her sophomore record because of the 7-track release that she had during the Kanye Surgical Summer 2018? I don't know. But this just could have been so much better if it was just cut in half. Trim the fat, you would have had a damn near classic. And then Muzz. With Muzz. It's the worst record because it's another NyQuil record. I really have nothing to say about this thing. It is just boring as shit. Other noteworthy releases, something that is not boring as shit and will definitely wake you up, is N's Splinters from an Ever-Changing Face. It's brutal. That's all. It's just brutal. Ear-shattering brutality. That is all. You also have Drab City, Good Songs for Bad People. This is a really interesting record with a lot of variety. It's definitely a vibe record, but the variety of vibes is just very consistent throughout. I enjoy it. And I hope you do too. Lamb of God's self-titled record. No really reinventing the wheel for these guys. It's just another solid Lamb of God record. If you like Lamb of God, you're gonna like this record. If you don't, you're not gonna. Point blank period. And the last record I wanted to give a shout out to here is Grey Days Amends. Rest in peace, Chester Bennington. From my understanding, this was the first band Chester was in before he joined Linkin Park. And basically, they re-recorded the instrumentation from some demos that they had back in the 90s. And they took some of Chester's vocals from those demos and put them on. And you can kind of hear that the vocals and the instrumentation aren't blended 100%. But Chester's vocal performance is very solid. The instrumentation's very good. I could have seen these guys probably going places if they had the proper promotional material. For something that had Chester's vocals from over 20 years ago, this is a very solid release. And I think if you really want to learn of Chester's earlier roots, this is a very, very good record to check out. So for July, with 25 records, the average album score is 6.64. The playlist also has 1 EP and 13 singles, totaling the month's score to 6.87. And July just picks that high point up even more. For July, I had listened to 34 albums, and most of them did not disappoint. However, there can only be a top 3. So for the bronze at number 3, we have The Lorne's Arms with Skeleton Coast, which is just a great punk record with soaring melodies, massive hooks. For 16 songs, it really didn't lose its momentum anywhere. For the silver, we have Blue and Exile with Miles. This is a 90-minute juggernaut jazz rap record, and not a minute is wasted on here. And last but certainly not least, for the gold, we have, I'm going to need to look at my screen to read this, Mulatu Astake and the Black Jesus Experience to Know Without Knowing. I apologize if I mispronounced the name. But this is my favorite jazz record of the year. It's just the most masterfully executed Ethio jazz, which fused a bunch of funk, hip-hop, spoken word, soul, just all together in such a way that still blows my mind with every listen. And while I am a little salty that the vinyl only has 6 of the tracks, truly every single song on here is just fantastic. And if you're looking for some new jazz to listen to, give this record a listen. And from my understanding, Mulatu has been around for decades, so I suppose this is a better jumping on point than never. Now, there were some low points in July, but not really all that bad. Dawn of Ashes, the Antimonian, is pretty much just industrial metal by the numbers. I mean, if you heard a Nine Inch Nails record with a little bit of screamo in the mix, that's pretty much what you get here. It's nothing really great, but then again, maybe you'll find more enjoyment out of it than I did. Overall, it's still pretty competent. We also had Neck Deep with All Distortions Are Intentional, which this is the kind of pop punk that I've sort of really grown away from. It's very polished. It has a little bit of heaviness to it, but overall, it could have been much better. Honestly, after the first track, I can't tell you if there was any good moment on here. It was pretty forgettable afterward. And for the number one worst record of July, and even this I would still rate like a 4 out of 10, is Dominic Fike's What Could Possibly Go Wrong. And when you have your album titled like that, expect something to go wrong. Honestly, this album sounded like more decent ideas than fully fleshed out songs. I think Dominic has some potential, but this was just not the best way to start. And other noteworthy releases this month, because July was just loaded with them, you have The Real Mackenzies with Beer and Loathing, which is just Celtic rock done right. You also have Logic's No Pressure, which was supposedly his final album until this Doc D record came out, which I have not listened to as of recording this yet, but basically under Logic's current discography, yeah, No Pressure is a solid send-off and truly showcased that Logic really did have some more down the pipe that was significantly better than anything he had released in 2019. You also had Taylor Swift's Folklore, which was the first Taylor Swift record I enjoyed in full. So, that's a first. And also Gulch with Impenetrable Cerebral Fortress, which is just 15 minutes of just face-melting, noisy as hell hardcore. Give that a shot. So with a total score of 244 divided by 34 albums, we have a average score of 7.17, which is already the highest score so far in this video. But, along with 2 EPs and 23 singles, you have a total score of 7.6 for July. Now, August sort of continued the trend from July to listening to a lot of stuff. But this was more close to May in the sense that there were a bunch of highs and a bunch of lows just sort of all over the place, although not nearly as dramatic as May, but still, a lot of hit and miss records this month. However, the hits were very high. For the top 3, for the bronze, we have Fantastic Negrito, Have You Lost Your Mind Yet, which is a great blend of blues, soul, hip-hop, and rock that I really would love to hear explored even further, because this is just a perfect blend that I wish was more what modern rock sounded like. For the silver, we have Ghost of Paul Revere, Good at Losing Everything. This is their best album so far, with a near perfect blend of their Americana bluegrass sound and some heartland rock that reminds me a lot of Springsteen. And pretty much the best thing that Ghost of Paul Revere did was just expand their musical horizons and add some drums. Thank you. Also, Maine representing. Woo! And for the gold, we have probably the album that grew on me the most this year, and that is Orbit Culture with Nisha. and which is an album that I did enjoy on first listen, but it just continued to grow on me with more and more listens. This is just a brilliant mix of groove, thrash, death metal. The production is massive. The atmosphere is dark and heavy. The sounds that are explored through these genres also have elements of both old and new in a way that is familiar, but also in a very unique approach. I truly hope that Orbit Culture continues this path, continues to experiment with this sound, because I love every second of this record. And the bottom three, like I said, the lows for this month weren't nearly as bad as May, but there were some. Burna Boy, Twice as Tall for my third spot here. It's just reggaeton and dancehall, which really I can just chalk up to not exactly my genre. I do like some elements of it here and there, some songs here and there, but a whole album's worth, it just feels like the songwriting on here just doesn't evolve or progress. It just kind of sounds like every reggaeton song I've heard on the radio. Stand Atlantic. Pretty much what I said about Neck Deep. This is the kind of pop punk that I have distanced myself from. It's very overproduced, sugary, sweet, where I swear to God it's giving me type 2 diabetes on top of my type 1. And for the number one worst record of August, we have Glass Animals with Dreamland, which is sort of the question, how many genres do you force to breed with before you abort your creation? The production and mixing is just all over the place on this record. The blends of genres, unlike Orbit Culture or even Poppy, to a more drastic extent, this record just does not blend its genres well at all. And just the mixing of everything, the volumes are all over the place, the lyrics are relatively nonsensical, or it tries to be serious in a slightly more whimsical manner, but just falls flat. Just, why are these weird genre blends a thing? But like I said, there were plenty of high points, and I want to shout out those albums as well before moving on to September here. We have Nabuya Garcia with Source, which is an amazing jazz debut with loads of variety to it. I would highly recommend checking this out if you're a huge fan of jazz of any capacity. We also have Amine with Limbo. This is just a perfectly executed, fun pop rap album. I guess I shouldn't say perfect. There are a couple of duds, but really the high points on here are just very high, very catchy, and Amine just continues to improve as an MC and just as an entertainer. And I truly hope that the follow-up to this is even better. You also have Biffy Clyro with A Celebration of Endings, which is the first record I've heard of this group, but I guess they've been around since the early 2000s. Slightly progressive, post-hardcore, pop rock mix. I really liked a lot of the sounds I was hearing from here, so maybe I'll check out their earlier discography here, but can we all just agree that their cover of WAP was one of the worst things that happened this year? And last but not least, I wanted to shout out Kill the Lights with The Sinner. This is the new band from the previous drummer of Bullet for My Valentine, and I can sort of hear sort of a Scream, Aim, Fire era in the songwriting here with a lot of the thrash elements. There's a little bit of djent, there's a little bit of groove, but overall, this record, just the high points on here were really high. I wasn't really a big fan of the ballad portions of this record, but all the heavier songs, all the energetic songs just hit all the right spots, and I'm really excited to see where Kill the Lights progress from here. Alright, out of 25 albums, the average for August was 6.92. Along with one EP and 22 singles, the total score for the month is 7.24. It's a little bit less than July, but still in the 7s, which is pretty damn solid. So September was a high point for me personally because I got married. But, of course, you're not here to listen to my personal life and telling everybody how much my wife is awesome, but you're here to listen about my opinions on music, for some reason. Yeah, September was good too, so here's the top 3. Conway the Machine with From a King to a God, and this is, I don't know why it took me so long to hop on the Griselda train, because this is insane. The production is varied. It has some old school sounding, really dark, atmospheric hip hop, but also a little bit of some, a little bit faster paced, even a little bit of dancier rhythms, but still very hardcore in the way that it's presented. And of course, Conway's presence is just dominating throughout the entire project, so I love the hell out of this thing. Also had one of the surprise records of the year for me at number 2, Fleet Foxes with Shore. It's definitely more accessible than the Crack Up was, and I'm not sure if I love this record just as much as the Crack Up, just because it is a little bit more streamlined, but that's really not a detriment to the record. If anything, it just shows Fleet Fox's versatility and just sort of how they've been able to reinvent their sound again and still make it sound this amazing. And last but not least, Idols with Ultramono as my favorite record of September. And yes, I'll just say it, as everyone else has said, this is not as strong as their last two, but it's still a fantastic goddamn record from one of the best up-and-coming bands. What more can you say? Now, the bottom 3, number 3 is actually not that bad. I think on my list, yeah, I rated this one a 6, is Gus Dapperton's Orca. And sort of like Dominic Fike's record, there's a lot of good ideas on here, just some ideas I think could have been more fleshed out and better executed. There are actually some good songs on here. So really, overall, most of the records were at the very least decent, with the exception of these two, which, oh boy. For the silver shit stain of September, we have Fame on Fire's Levels, which is an ironic title because it feels like this record never progresses. It's just stuck on tutorial mode with these really bland fusions of alt metal, new metal, hip hop, and electronic, all fused together in what they marketed as genre defying, when really it's nothing more than genre defining in how fucking lazy this thing sounds. Like, I don't even know any modern radio rock band that sounds this generic. I mean, give Papa Roach all the shit in the world from the last record they made. At least it was recognizably, uniquely bad. This is just so goddamn bland that, granted, I'm gonna forget it after I've listened to it, but while listening to it, it is pure torture. However, somehow it is not as bad, just barely, to Young Boy Never Broke Again's Top. And I might be in the minority here, because somehow the record reached number 1. Hip Hop Twitter, come at me and tell me what I'm not seeing in this record, because this thing is just 20 tracks of, yeah, the instrumental was okay. I wish the rapper wasn't on it. But, like I said, those two, while extremely bad as they were, there were a lot of great releases throughout this entire month. In fact, you had Delta Spirit with What Is There, which is just indie rock with great production and songwriting. It's definitely a little bit with some of that adult contemporary edge to it, but it's done in a way that is not boring, especially the guitar work on this thing. Woo! You also have Joji's Nectar, which, while it's a bit of a bloated record and a bit inconsistent with how every track sort of plays out, the high points on here are easily some of Joji's best and some of my favorite songs of the entire year. So I love Joji's trajectory following this record. I hope that he continues to experiment, but maybe just trims a little bit of the fat on the follow-up to this. Also, Spillage Village with Spillington. Basically the same thing with the Joji record can be applied here. It's a little bit bloated, but the high points on here are just absolutely excellent. Jid, Earth Gang, and crew, who unfortunately I'm not remembering off the top of my head every single person involved in this project because there were a lot of people involved in this project, but it is absolutely solid. If you're a fan of some really interesting, quirky, but really rooted hip-hop, check this thing out. And last but not least, I did want to bring a shout out to Deftones' Ohms. It was just cut from my list. It's not quite my favorite Deftones record, but a good Deftones record is still a very good Deftones record. And it's a bit more memorable and more hard-hitting than Gore was. So if you guys weren't as big a fan on Gore and really was hoping for something a little bit more immediate and a little bit thrashy while still being experimental, this record is actually for you. So out of 28 albums listened to over the course of September, the average score album-wise was 6.71, and the playlist includes also 1 EP and 21 singles, bringing the total score for September to 7.02. Still in the sevens. Let's see if this will keep up in October. So just like July, October had a lot of records that I listened to over the course of the month. I believe I listened to 31 records over the course of the month, and there were plenty of singles and EPs as well. And while the start of October was not quite the strongest releases, the rest of the month, oh my god, added so much to my year-end top 50. But, of course, in this video, I'm only giving you the top 3 for this month. So, at number 3, we have Bring Me the Horizon's Post-Human Survival Horror. Consider this one sort of the cheat on the list, because technically this was promoted as an EP and sold as an EP, even though the producer was quoted saying this shouldn't have been promoted as an EP, where originally they were planning on maybe 4 or 5 songs, and then they just kept recording until 9 songs and half an hour later. And if I'm adding Denzel Curry in my top 50, and that one's an album that's under 20 minutes, I don't see why I can't add this either. This is easily some of Bring Me the Horizon's catchiest and I think best realized material. It's heavier than Amo, but still has some of the electronics and pop elements that made some of the best moments on there really interesting. So the fusion of that and sort of a fusion back to their earlier metalcore sound, the way that it was all mixed together, it basically sounds like a Linkin Park nu metal revival, but in the best way. Hey, Fame on Fire, take notes. For the silver, we have Black Thought with Stream of Thoughts 3, Cain and Abel, the official solo debut album of one of the best MCs of all time. And outside of one song, and for those who listen to this record, you know the one, Black Thought just absolutely kills every single verse. Production is just immaculate, hardcore hip-hop. His lyricism, his storytelling is just still holds up so well after all these decades of activity. The guy really hasn't lost an edge. And for the top spot of October, we have Benny the Butcher with Burden of Proof, the second Griselda record that I've added onto this list. And yeah, this thing is just fantastic. Benny's lyricism, his presentation is just classic hardcore hip-hop at its finest with really solid production from Hit Boy. I can only wait to hear more from this guy and Conway and just Griselda in general. How did I sleep on these guys for this long? So for as many great records as there were in October, there were a few duds. Unfortunately, most of them were actually disappointments. While I can't say that these would be in my top 10 worst list, these were definitely, if I had a disappointment list, these would be pretty high. YG's My Life 400 at number 3. Pretty much where I enjoyed half the record and I didn't enjoy half the record. Basically, it's a wash, just like most of YG's catalog since Still Brazy. And for number 2, we have Mr. Bungle with the Wrath of the Easter Bunny demo, which at first I really enjoyed for how weird of an approach to thrash metal this album was, and just how expressive and unique the approach was. But the more and more I listened to it, the more and more grating it became. The jams just sort of lead off into nowhere with a lot of noodly vocal, not vocal, guitar solos, but speaking of the vocals, Mike just goes full-on obnoxious on this record, in which, with Dead Cross, it kind of worked. Here, it does not. Not for 7 minutes a song. No. But somehow, an even bigger disappointment, which I wasn't even planning it to be a disappointment, was Corey Taylor's CMFT. It sounded like he had a lot of fun with this record. He explores some Stone Sour style alt metal. He also explores some southern rock and some very bizarre rap rock blends. It sounds like he had a lot of fun making this. I'm just sad that I didn't really enjoy listening to it. But again, it's not one of the worst things I've heard. Most likely, you might find some more enjoyment out of it than I did, but yeah, I'm just looking forward to the next Slipknot record. Sorry. But again, as the trend has been for the past few months of this video, is that there are so many great releases that it pretty much trumps a lot of the losses. Other noteworthy albums were Touche Amour's Lament, which is just excellent post-hardcore with a little bit of variety in the songwriting to really make it stand out. It's easily the most accessible record to date, but I would say also one of their best to date. You also had Jello Biafra and the Guantanamo School of Medicine with Tea Party Revenge Porn. Hey Dead Kennedys, take fucking notes. Your old lead singer is doing what you should be doing, not praising Mitt Romney and Lindsey Graham, you fucking hacks. You also have Open Mike Eagle with Anime, Trauma, and Divorce. This is really a great record capturing Mike's mental state, processing his divorce and how he copes with it. And while it's not a perfect record by any means, it's a very solid hip-hop record with some very interesting production choices and, of course, Mike's comedic lyricism that I think everyone would enjoy. It's a very weird record, but I think you'll like it. And last but not least, Busta Rhymes' Extinction Level Event 2. He finally came out with an extremely solid record after Year of the Dragon, thank fuck. And while this album is extremely bloated, the highs far outweigh the lows. And the lows on here, I can't say are really that bad, with the exception of that Dawn and the Boss song. I will never fully understand why that was a single. But other than that, yeah, this is easily Busta's best record since the first Extinction Level Event. So, give this a listen. Do it! Are you heading to bed?
Yeah.
Okay.
Nerd!
Mean. So out of the 31 records I listened to over the course of October, the average score album-wise was 7.09. And on the playlist, I also have one EP, not including Bring Me the Horizon, and 18 singles, bringing the score up to 7.37. Man, 2020 has been solid. But did November keep up? Now, November is the last month where a lot of major releases happened, and of course, that usually tends to be the marketing ploy. You want to get all these big albums out right before the holidays, and of course, year-end best lists, things of that nature. But I can't really say that the albums I listened to over the course of November really hit the highs that July or even October did. And while these top 3 definitely did make my top 50 list, a lot of the records I listened to over the course of this month was just kinda, they exist. However, top 3. Bronze, we have King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard with KG. This is them sort of returning back to the microtonal phase of their career and sort of reapproaching it with a little bit of different funk and dancier rock elements. And while not a perfect record, I do think holds up very, very well. And considering King Gizzard still has this much creativity in their system after releasing fucking 15 records over the course of the 2010s. The fact that they had this much still in their tank, just reapproaching their sounds, I'm pretty intrigued to see what other styles they will either sort of come back to or reapproach or even blend different phases of their career. They still got plenty in their tank. I don't see any reason why they should stop. For the silver, we have Aesop Rock with Spirit World Field Guide. Aesop bringing more lyrically dense clusterfuckery that still sounds amazing over some very bombastic and solid production. You can't really go wrong with another solid Aesop Rock record. Aesop Rock record. Aesop Rock record. It's not a tongue twister. How did that just slip? And for the gold of November, one of the last great records released over the course of 2020 was Chris Stapleton's Starting Over. Easily the best country record of the year. He comes through with easily some of his most rocking material to date, and Chris Stapleton just still sounds amazing. So, yeah, if you're looking for an extremely solid country rock record, hit your dude up. What was that? Yee yee! And of course, with the top three, there must be a bottom three. And like I said, really a lot of these records that end up in the bottom of the list here just really kind of ended up existing. And not in a very entertaining way. At number 3, we had Ghost Kid with the self-titled record, which it seems like a record I should actually like a lot more than I did. It has some industrial metal elements, it has sort of some rap rock elements, and it's not like the record itself is actually that bad. It just doesn't come off as anything new or interesting, which I really, really wish it did. But just nothing really memorable came from this. With the exception of that one track that I did feature in the playlist with the featured vocalist from a band. And even less memorable, but in a more emo soul vein that's sort of been the thing for the past couple of years, really making waves over the course of 2020, is Fora with Love 2. And I'm not sure if I should check out the first one, but the sequel definitely leaves a lot to be desired in this front. I've heard emo back in 2007. I've heard some really good emo soul over the course of this year. This one just does nothing for me. But somehow less memorable is Smashing Pumpkins' Sire, which unfortunately gets the gold shit stain of this month because what happened? Did I miss something with the Smashing Pumpkins discography where all of a sudden they just really try these really bland electronic elements and really bland alt-rock elements that just do not blend well at all? They did this in 1998 so much better, but somehow in 2020 they completely make one of the most boring records of their entire career. What happened? Did I miss something? But of course, there were far more positives than negatives over the course of this month. We have a few shout-outs on here as well with Goody Mob's Survival Kit, where it's just a great album that is much more cohesive than the previous one, Age Against the Machine. It definitely has more of the Dungeon Family feel to it, definitely has some old-school Goody Mob vibes, but with some more modern elements to it, and which, again, not a perfect record, I think really deserves much more attention than it received. Hey Penny, do you want to stop barking? You also had Salim Rami, or Rami, I hope I pronounced that right, with Black on Purpose, which is a truly We also have Salim Rami, or Rami, I hope I pronounced your name right. I apologize if you happen to come across this Know Nothing video and hear me mispronounce your name. But Black on Purpose, a very solid pro-black record. Yeah, I'm all for it. This thing is fantastic. There's plenty of features. Production is fantastic. Black Thought's on here at least a few times, I believe. There's multiple times where one feature will be on another song. But really, overall, the context behind this record is great. The execution behind this record is great. Everything about this record's great. We also had Meg Thee Stallion's Good News. Finally, her debut record, and it's good. I can't say it's great. There's definitely some elements that it feels like the label just had to shoehorn in some really trendy bullshit, and Meg is sort of coming across a little bit stagnant in terms of lyrical content, but overall, her flows are still great, and the songs that do hit really hard. Probably if you trimmed this down to 12 tracks, including the Savage remix, Girls in the Hood, and Don't Stop singles, instead of just chucking them all the way at the back end because they were promotional singles. Fuck off with that shit. They were the best tracks on here, but still. If you cut this down to at least the best 12, even 13 tracks, I think Meg would have had a extremely solid debut. But for what it is, it's still good. It's just a little bit bloated and a bit all over the place sonically. And last but certainly not least, we have Pop Sicko Volume 2 by Spencer Albee. Another shout out to another main artist, one of the best songwriters currently in the game, with another collection of retro pop tunes. Can't really go wrong with that. Now, for November, the average score out of 25 albums comes to 6.3, and I didn't really have any EPs on the list. However, I did have about 18 singles on the list, so the total score for November adds up to 6.51, pretty much rivaling January. And of course, I can't really close this off without mentioning December, and while my cutoff date is usually December 15th, just because there's not really a ton of releases past that point, there were still some really solid albums that did come out at the end of the year that I felt do deserve a little bit of a shout out. So this is going to be a little bit shorter because there's not really a lot to talk about, but the top three, we have Kid Cudi with Man on the Moon 3, The Chosen. Kid Cudi coming back with easily his best album since the second one. And it does have a bit more of a Travis Scott modern influence, but I think Kid Cudi just knocks it out of the park with the vast majority of this record, and I'm glad to see that he's on the right path again. For the silver, we have Rico Nasty's Nightmare Vacation, in which while lyrically it can be a little bit one note in the if I'm not fucking you, I'm fucking you up sort of motif, Rico just expands her variety production-wise and vocal delivery-wise to make it really an entertaining listen throughout the vast majority of the record. And I'm glad that her debut came off as good as it did. I just wish it was released a little bit earlier and got a lot more attention. And for the gold, I have to give a shout out to one of my Vermont homeboys, Jarv, and with production from Pajama Sam, with Flow Stimulus. Oh, I did not know I needed this record, but god damn, I'm so glad it came out. Jarv is coming through with more of his storytelling and lyrical content, more so than his technical ability that he's known for, which I do enjoy quite a bit, but he comes through here with some of his best lyrical content to date, and Pajama Sam comes through with some really old school flavor boom bap that really fits Jarv's style extremely well, where he has these really bouncy flows and sort of laid back delivery, but it allows you to really digest everything that Jarv is saying. So to both of these guys, fantastic job, and I hope to have a sequel to Flow Stimulus. Maybe? And for the bottom three, because there really wasn't a ton to choose from, we had August '08 with Emotional K, which has some catchy songs, but unfortunately not all that memorable. That's really about it. You also had Red City Radio with Paradise, which, same can be said, just in a more indie hard rock vein. There's a couple of really solid tracks on here, but overall the rest is just kind of there. And number one for what I would consider the worst, come on, it had to be Eminem's Music to be Murdered By Side B, or Music to be Buried By. While the production is more consistent than the first record, the content on here, whew, I will say it's not as bad as Revival, but it does get really close. It's pretty much just Eminem saying the same things that he's already said with a slightly more COVID punchline reference type of stuff. Yeah, it's pretty much, if you took both sides of this record, the best moments of both sides, and made them into one album, which obviously both records are technically different because one was released pre-COVID and one during COVID, but basically, if you took both sides of the record, took the best elements of each one, you would have another decent Eminem record. But instead, we have to have another side to this collection here that just ultimately adds nothing. And that's really the sad part. Despite that there are a few highlights on this record, the low points on here almost rival that of Revival and some of the lower points of Kamikaze. Not quite encore levels of garbage, but God, I hope this trend goes a little bit in a more upward trajectory. Please, Eminem, come on! And other noteworthy releases, again, being December, not that many, but Taylor Swift did surprise us with Evermore, which is another record of hers I listened to in full that I fully enjoyed. I really do like the direction that Taylor is going in with this more indie rock, chamber pop type of thing, and I hope that she continues to explore this a little bit further and experiments with it just a little bit, and maybe doesn't make the record 15 songs long. But, you know, the low points really weren't that bad. That's just me being nitpicky. And last but not least, the Avalanches We Will Always Love You, which is just a great electronic record from some great electronic legends. I mean, must I really go any further in depth? Out of the 13 records I listened to over the course of December, the average score was 6.42, and there were 5 EPs and 13 singles, which actually boosted this up quite a bit to 7.5, which I think is a really solid way to end the year, month-wise. There weren't as many albums, but there were quite a few EPs that I enjoyed as well. So, again, all the playlists are in the description down below if you want to check out every single thing that I listened to. And now for 2020's grand total, pretty much adding up every score of the month, totaling to 83.22, and divide that by 12. 2020 as a whole musically gets 6.93. I was really happy with all the highlights that 2020 did end up giving us in a musical sense, considering the year to many was probably the worst for them. And hopefully everything starts sort of getting a little bit better in 2021. I truly hope so. 2020 on a personal level was pretty solid for me, but at the same time, I know it wasn't for everybody. And for some people, maybe just music was not the first thing that they needed to focus on. And hey, I totally get you. However you coped and survived 2020, you do you, and hopefully you're doing better now that 2021 has really started to come in. So thank you guys for watching. I'm Greg Gregarious Media. I hope you guys have a really solid 2021. See ya in hopefully the next couple of weeks here with the month in music, January 2021. Let's see if this year's January can beat January of 2020. I'll see you then.